Assurance strategy. Well, that was a mouthful, Sharon, and you're going to have to talk to us now about it for the next 45 minutes.
It's lovely. Thanks so much, Katie, and thanks so much for the warm welcome. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here today. I would absolutely share your sentiments, Katie, with respect to Orla. I've been with Aztec now for about a year and a half or so, and really loving it. It's a great team to work with. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, I suppose, the hidden ROI of regulatory and design assurance strategy and how that can save you time, cost, and sanity. And I think sanity is maybe the most important piece of that sometimes. And anyone who's involved in this will certainly know the level of work involved. Just, I suppose, firstly, just some quick introductions. Myself, I've been around the medtech industry for probably longer than I'd like to admit, but definitely more than 20 years. Started out in regulatory affairs, did a good stint in R&D and DA, and then took a little bit of a journey sideways out into the research arena, where I worked in collaborative research with industry partners for a number of years, and then joined Aztec, as I said, about a year and a half ago. So nice kind of, I suppose, broad experience, and definitely a great way to learn in terms of trying something new. I suppose a quick introduction then to Aztec ourselves for those who may not know us. As Katie mentioned, it was founded by Orla Connington, and I guess really our mission is to support medical device developers in their pursuit of compliance and product excellence. I suppose that's really kind of our main mantra. And we do that by offering support across four main pillars: regulatory affairs, design assurance, quality management, and clinical compliance. We're located locally here in Galway. And we support clients both locally, nationally and internationally. And our client partners are across universities, startups, right through to leading multinationals. So we have experience across the board in supporting different client types. I suppose in terms of what we'll cover then in the workshop, so this, I guess, really is aimed at kind of maybe more startup and early stage companies. And in a way, I guess it's kind of a back to basics in terms of regulation and design assurance. And I suppose I personally believe it's very important to really understand things at a top level, and then understand also how it filters down and is implemented in more detail. So I'm hoping to kind of cover that today. We'll look at regulatory affairs. What is regulation in its truest sense? How does that apply on a practical level? We'll talk about the definitions of medical devices. And then also, I suppose, really, and most importantly, how you can leverage your regulatory strategy to support your business growth. We'll talk also about design assurance, what it is, the process around it, how it links into risk management and how that's a key piece of it. And then I suppose finally really looking at utilising the design assurance process to support efficient product development, and how to do that in a way that you can do it as quickly and as cost effectively as possible. So why is this important? Well, firstly, funders and investors that are in this space, they know what's involved in bringing a medical device to market, and it's important that you do too, and it's important that you demonstrate to them that you know what's involved. Also ensuring your business planning and your funding strategy are actually structured to actually support you in addressing the requirements. Anyone in the medical device arena will know it's a long road to get a product onto the market, and even more so for a startup. So making sure that your strategy and your funding strategy in particular is going to get you there is really, really important. So you need to know the roadmap so that you can design your strategy in line with that roadmap. It's also important to understand the importance of regulatory requirements, in particular in terms of how it affects the commercialization of your device. So every jurisdiction has its own regulatory requirements. It's important to understand the difference between them, and then understand what makes sense for you as a company as to what jurisdictions you might target first, and then what jurisdictions come next. And then lastly, and I think sometimes this can be a little bit overlooked, it's in terms of the exit points in due diligence. So a prospective buyer will want to know, and they'll want to see evidence that your product has been developed properly in line with regulatory requirements, and that when they buy it, they can go ahead, put it straight out on the market. They don't have to worry about remediation or anything like that. And I think, as I say, this to me is really kind of one of the aspects people tend not to maybe consider, but really, really important in terms of an exit point. So firstly, we'll talk a little bit about regulation. So what is regulation? And I suppose really at a base level, it's about protecting the patient and the user. That's really the most important thing from a regulatory perspective. It's there to ensure that devices are placed on the market, that they're safe and they don't pose undue risk. And I suppose just to put a bit of context on that, the word safety appears 290 times in the EU MDR. That's a lot, and to me that really, really sets intent in terms of what the regulation is trying to achieve and how important safety is to the regulators. Regulation is also there to ensure that devices are effective for their intended purpose, or that they perform as intended. So again, different jurisdictions use slightly different vernacular, but it really means the same thing. So your device needs to be both safe and effective. So it has to pose no undue risk to the user or the patient, but it has to do what you intend it to do as well. And that's what regulation is all about, is proving that that is the case before you put your product out onto the market. Ultimately, we're looking at reducing risk to the patient and the user, but also it's not just about the design and development, it's also about manufacturing and making sure your product is manufactured in a controlled way. So the product that you've designed and tested and proven to be safe is exactly the same as the product that goes out on the market. And ultimately, the burden of proof is on the manufacturer. It is up to you to prove to regulators that your device is safe, it's effective, and manufactured in accordance with the regulations. So how does it work? And I think sometimes people struggle to kind of understand how regulation applies on a practical scale and how you actually apply it day to day within the business. So taking our top level, we have the regulations themselves, the EU MDR, for example, or 21 CFR. For the US jurisdiction, and again for other jurisdictions, they would have their own regulations as well. So that's the law, that's the regulation, and this is what you need to achieve and prove compliance to before you put your product on the market. So how do you do that? Well, you do that primarily by using standards to show that you meet the requirements of that regulation. So probably the most commonly understood of this would be ISO 13485, the quality management standard for medical devices. So you would use that to show that you meet the regulatory requirements by following that standard and having a standardized quality management system. Now, one standard may not address every requirement in the regulations, but you use it as a vehicle to prove your compliance. So if you have a standard, how do you apply that on the ground within your company? So you build those standards into your documentation. So whether that's a standard operating procedure, your quality manual, it may be your product specifications and testing, depending on the type of standard. So you start, I suppose it trickles down from the top. You start with the regulation at the top. You're using the standards to prove that you meet the regulation, and you do that by building your standards into your processes and your quality management system within your company. So then looking at medical device themselves and the definition of what's a medical device. Now I've modified this a little bit just to make it a little bit smaller, just to fit on the slide. But the most important thing is that the falling under the definition of a medical device is around what you claim your product will do. So if you're claiming that your product is intended to be used on human beings for a specific medical purpose, or for the medical purposes listed here, then it's likely you fall under the definition of a medical device. But it is linked back to the intended use you set for your product and the claims that you make around it. And we'll talk a little bit about the nuances of being a medical device and falling under that definition or not. The definition then under the United States regulation is something similar, and you'll see under point B here again, it talks about the intended use of the device. So again, it links back to what you as the manufacturer and the person putting the product onto the market, what do you intend for this product to do? So talking about the nuances then of being a medical device or not. What you will find, or what a strategy that could be employed by companies, is to maybe have a device, maybe introduce it out onto the market as a consumer device, and then perhaps expand its indication or its intended use out into the medical device arena. A really good example of this is the Apple Watch. So when the Apple Watch first came out, obviously it would connect to your phone, but maybe it counted your steps, but it didn't have a medical purpose as such. But since then and over the years, there's been software and apps added to the Apple Watch that are medical devices and that do have a medical purpose. So it's just interesting to see, I suppose, the growth in terms of the products starting out as a consumer electronic and then moving across into the medical device arena and being regulated as such under the US FDA. Just a note then on medical device classification. So in terms of the risk level of the devices are classified. This particular graphic here is specific to Europe. It is different again in different jurisdictions, but the higher the level of risk they pose, the higher class device they are, and the higher class device they are, the higher the level of associated regulatory oversight, as you might expect. So a class 1 device might be something simple, something you would expect that wouldn't have a high risk profile with respect to use on patients or with respect to the user, and then right up to class 3 devices, which would be things like implants and pacemakers, so things that are maybe life sustaining or life supporting, very, very high risk in terms of the patients that they serve, and again would have a much higher bar in terms of the regulatory oversight that they would have. So if this is the only thing you take away today, I'll be very happy, to be honest. I think this is really, really important concept for people to have. And that's the fact that really you're developing 2 products. So everybody focuses on the product on the right, the technical product. They know what they want to develop, they know what they want it to do, and they focus all their time and energy in making sure that they develop that product and they develop it right. But the reality is you're actually developing a second product, and that's your technical documentation. So if you fast forward past your development process through to where you're doing a regulatory submission and you're hoping to commercialize your product, at the end of the day, the regulatory submission that you put in front of the regulator is the documentation, and that's all they get to see. They don't get to meet the CEO of the company. You don't get to pitch in the same way you would with an investor. All they will see is the technical documentation that you have in relation to your product. And it's on that technical documentation that they will determine whether or not your device is worthy of approval. So while you're developing your technical product, it's really, really important that you're documenting what you're doing, how you're doing it, and that you're doing it in line with the regulations, and that you have the documentation to prove it. Because without that documentation, you won't have your regulatory submission to put in front of the regulator. And it's very difficult for them to determine whether or not your product meets the requirements. So as I say, if there's nothing else you take from this presentation today, certainly take that with you when you go. So there's 4 pillars really associated with not just medical device development, but medical device manufacture, and in terms of demonstrating medical device compliance. So the first one is regulatory affairs. We also have the quality management system, design assurance, and also clinical evaluation. And we'll really only talk about regulatory affairs and design assurance today, but it is important to understand that it's not the full story in terms of what's required. And also those activities are supported by the quality management system and clinical evaluation. We will touch on the QMS today, but primarily we'll talk about regulatory affairs and design assurance. So in terms of the process, so you have your regulatory activities, your design assurance activities, and you would also have your clinical evaluation activities. But the most important part is that all those activities are underpinned by your quality management system. Without your quality management system, the data that's generated just won't be accepted by a regulator. They expect to see it controlled, approved and reviewed through a quality management system. And only when that happens will they deem it to be acceptable data in terms of supporting the safety and efficacy of your device. So your quality management system is really, really foundational in terms of completing your product development cycle and indeed right through to commercialization. But out of that process then comes your regulatory submission. So all of the documentation of these activities will come together at the end into your regulatory submission and onto the technical documentation that you'll use to maintain your product afterwards. So be it your medical device file or the technical file, but ultimately the documentation that you do as part of your development process will become the foundation for the technical documentation going forward. So a quick note then on regulatory strategy. So I think a lot of people know that you need to have a regulatory strategy, but maybe don't quite know what to do with it when they have one. So it's really important that you understand what the regulatory strategy does and how it actually serves your business. It's also important to understand that regulatory is embedded within your business. I think people tend to look at it as maybe a separate activity, or we know it's something we need to do, but it's different. It's not actually part of the business, but it's actually a really, really, really important piece of your business. Firstly, it'll determine the risk categorization of your device. So as I mentioned earlier, the higher the risk categorization for your device, the higher the regulatory bar is. So you need to understand what the burden of proof is on you as a manufacturer in relation to the risk categorization of your device, because that informs everything that you do going forward. Your regulatory strategy provides the roadmap for your design and testing activities. So again, the higher class of your device, the higher the bar in terms of the burden of proof. So your regulatory strategy will help you determine what level of testing is required for your product, what standards apply to your product. Might you need to go as far as an animal study or a clinical trial? And again, all related back to the risk categorization of your device, which is determined through your reg strategy. It also looks at the jurisdictions you plan to target and when, and maybe what order you're going to target them in. So you may pick one jurisdiction to start with, and then roll out to other jurisdictions afterwards, and again addressing their individual regulatory requirements as you go. But as you can imagine, all of this information feeds into your business plan, your funding strategy, and your commercialization strategy. So in order for you to get on the market and to fully commercialize your product, you need to understand the roadmap in terms of how to get there, and your regulatory strategy will give you that roadmap. So really important that it's tightly linked to your business plan, your funding strategy, and your commercialization strategy as you move through product development. So this is a quote that came from a previous workshop that I had done with an accelerator group. And one of the people at the table, I think had been through the pathway before, and they were quite insistent. They said the same. They kept reflecting the same back to us. In the world of medtech, your regulatory strategy is your business strategy. So they're really intrinsically linked, and it's really, really important that you understand that in terms of getting your product approved and commercialized. So on to design assurance then. So what is design assurance? I think people struggle a little bit to really kind of pin down what design assurance is. And I think when you think of a production line, it's very easy to understand how you can monitor a production line. You can check the products coming off a production line, particularly if it's a high volume. You can track and trace it. The thing is, you only design once. So how do you make sure that your design is of good quality? How do you do that? So design assurance is that process. And ultimately, it's the implementation and documentation of the design development process. So we spoke earlier about, those two products. This is the process that will help you develop your technical product, and that's really what this process does. It'll help you provide evidence that the design development process was followed. And again, this will form part of your regulatory submission and your technical documentation going forward. It'll ensure that the right elements are addressed at the right time. And we'll talk a little bit about the actual process itself. We'll talk through the waterfall flow chart in a little while. But really what it does, it's actually a very logical process, but it just makes sure that you're doing the right things at the right time and in the right order, and you're asking the right questions, and that you're reviewing as you go, and making sure you're controlling how your design has been developed and tested. The design development process also helps you define and execute your verification and validation activities, so the actual testing data that proves the safety and effectiveness of your device. The design assurance function would always work in tandem with R&D, so I guess they kind of sit a little bit between quality and R&D. And I suppose the kind of phrase we tend to use to describe it is packing the parachute. So when you're out there, in particular in the startup world, you're out there as the CEO, you're raising money, you're focused on the commercialization side of the business. Your design assurance people are right there behind you, packing the parachute, having it ready to go for when you're putting in your regulatory submission. It's there, it's packaged up, it's ready to go, and you can move forward from a commercialization standpoint. So as I mentioned, the output of your design assurance process is your technical documentation, and that product is equally as important as the technical product, because it is the technical documentation that you will use to support your regulatory submission and to prove compliance. So this is a requirement. You are required to have that technical documentation on file, and to keep it up to date throughout the life cycle of the product. So it's not just about getting to submission, it's about supporting your product right through its full life cycle, even when it's out there in the market. Ultimately, that documentation is used, as I've mentioned, to provide evidence your device is safe and effective for its intended purpose, that you have identified all your risks and that you've reduced them as much as you possibly can, and that you followed that prescribed controlled design process, and your product has been designed with a high quality output in mind. So what does it cover? It covers the design development process itself, and that's probably the key driver for design assurance. But within that process, there are many factors that you cover as well. Risk management is probably key among them. And again, this is all about reducing risk, increasing the safety of your product as much as you possibly can, and reducing risk as much as you possibly can. You'll also look at usability and human factors engineering. It will cover performance standards, biocompatibility, sterilization, labeling, software, and many other things. Anything that would support and help to prove the compliance of your product to regulatory requirements would fall under the scope of design assurance. So it's quite broad, and anyone who works in the area will certainly say, no 2 days are the same. Really, really interesting place to work. Yeah, just I suppose takes a bit of creativity, but definitely very interesting part of the business. So we'll talk a little bit through the design development process. And I do believe fundamentally that the design development process is a really, really logical process. And there's really nothing in here that as a designer or an innovator that you wouldn't already do, right? The design development process really asks you to do it in a logical way, ask the right questions at the right time, and then review as you go, and make sure that you're I suppose overseeing the process, and that it's overseen by the right people. So irrespective of what you're designing, be it medical device or not, It's pretty logical to assume that the first thing you need to understand is what is it that the product needs to do and what does the person using it need to do. So it's no surprise that you would start with your user needs for your design and development process. It's the cornerstone of the process. The most important thing, and in terms of developing a device that's safe and effective, you need to understand what it's going to do, what you want it to do, but more importantly, what the user needs from it. So the first thing you would do is understand and establish your user needs. And then you would translate those into design inputs. So user needs tend to be kind of a wish list, maybe from a clinician. Oh, we'd love if it did this. It's important that it does that, but tends to be quite maybe a little bit vague. The difference between user needs and design inputs is that your design inputs are essentially translating your user needs into an engineering level of detail. So you're drilling it down to something that is measurable, verifiable, and really something that you can make a design decision based on. So translating it into design inputs is really, really key piece from a development standpoint, because it really lays out the requirements of your device down to a level that you can really make a design decision based on. Other things that might feed into your design inputs will be maybe early risk management as well. So when you look at your early stage hazards, understanding what maybe your top level risks are, they would all feed into your design inputs as well, and maybe performance and device standards too. So generally speaking, your design input is a big document. There's a lot of information in there, but it really is probably the most fundamental piece of your design development process, because it's based on your body of design inputs that you make your design decisions. Those design inputs then are fed into the design process. So this is really, as I say, where the magic happens. This is where you actually design your device, you make your decisions, and you come up with your final product design. And out of that process come your design outputs. So your design outputs are essentially the blueprint for your product. That's how I always view it. The full complement, it could be a series of drawings, it could be material specs, it could be production instructions, it could be test methods, but the totality of all those outputs put together are the blueprint for your device, and it's essentially what will be transferred across into manufacturing at the end of the day to manufacture the device, and they will become your manufacturing specs, but it really is the blueprint for your device. And then the totality of those design outputs put together is the medical device itself. So now you've developed your product, you know what it is, you've decided, you have finalized your design, this is the product we're bringing to market. What do you do now? Well, now you have to prove it's safe and effective. So you've developed your device based on the user needs. How do you know it actually does what the user needs it to do? So firstly, you start with verification. And verification looks at outputs versus inputs. So if you've specified a particular design input, for example, maybe a length needs to be a certain length if it might work with an endoscope, for example, and it would need to be long enough to travel through the length of the endoscope. So you might have a length requirement. So you want to check that the design output or the design decision that you have made within your design process with respect to the product is actually right. So is it long enough to go through the endoscope? Does it have the right length? So that's a verification step. And verification can be quite discrete. It can look at one output and one input. Your test might just look at one piece, or it might look at a combination of inputs and outputs together, depending on your device design. But it's proving that your output meets your input. You then move to validation. So validation looks at it at a higher level and a much more holistic level. So you're looking at the medical device as a whole. So does your medical device do what the users had asked for in the first place? So you had started with your user needs. They had given you a wish list. These are the things we need this device to do. Now you need to prove that the medical device that you have produced at the end of your design development process does actually meet their needs. So that's your validation step. And the last piece of the flow chart is review. And again, really, really important part, making sure this is your checks and balance. making sure that you are reviewing your product throughout the whole process. So once you've established your user needs, you review them. Are they correct? And you review them with the people who are appropriate to review them. So that could be with clinical input or marketing input, but you're making sure, yes, the body of user needs we've put together are appropriate for the device we're trying to develop. You then translate that into design inputs. Again, review. Are they correct? Are they appropriate? And so on through the whole process. So it's a system, it's a logical system in terms of following through from what a user needs a product to do right through to the product design, but always checking, are we going the right direction? Is it still appropriate? And is the device doing what we intended it to do? So how do you do that on a practical scale? So looking at the waterfall flow chart, it doesn't exactly tell you how to do it on a practical scale. So generally speaking, the design development process will be split out into a number of phases. So there's no written rules in terms of how many phases you should or shouldn't have, but generally, and again, depending on the complexity of the device itself, but generally, this would be the type of phased approach we would use. But again, each company has their own methodology for doing it. So everything within your concept phase, and I suppose all of your development up until that point is all feasibility, prototyping, and really establishing your user needs. And once you have those established, you conduct a review and you move into phase 2, which is inputs and planning. So this is where you put together your design plan and crucially develop your design inputs. Phase 3 then is the development itself. So you're taking those inputs, you're putting them into your design process, and out of that process comes your design outputs. And at the end of it would be locking of your final device design. So you've now finalized your design. This is the design we're moving forward, bringing into phase 4, which is verification and validation, which would be your formal device testing. And at the end of that, typically, is where your regulatory submission and approval will come in. After that, once you have that, then, or again, depending on some companies, will continue into transfer while they're waiting for the submission. It just depends on from company to company. But your design transfer then is making sure that the exact product and the exact product design that you have tested and that you have designed and that you locked in at design freeze gets transferred into production and is being produced exactly as you intended. And then your final phase is commercialization. And realistically, this is the largest of the phases because it's the full life cycle of the product. It's following your product out on the market, your post-market surveillance, making sure that it continues to perform as intended, sustaining it out there in the product marketplace. So it is the largest of the phases, but it's, I suppose, in some ways, I won't say the closeout because design development never really stops because there is a continuous feedback from your post-market surveillance, but it's the final phase, shall we say, of design and development process. Very hard to talk about product development and design and development without risk management. The two really are very closely related and they are literally hand in hand. And I suppose it's something that you would naturally do, and it's something that engineers and product developers naturally do as part of their development process. That you will just by nature identify risks as part of it. The biggest problem is actually documenting that, and in particular back in the early stages of development, making sure you're writing it down and that you're documenting that as you go. Really important part of it. But also understanding your device risks as early as you can in your process will help you, firstly, make sure your product is safe, inherently safe by design, but also it reduces the possibility of rework or repeated effort. So the earlier you understand the risks, if you identify your risks way back where you're establishing user needs and design inputs, it can be designed directly into your device. Whereas if you're halfway through verification and validation and you uncover a new risk, you now have to go back, possibly redesign your device, possibly repeat testing. It can be a really, really costly thing to do that. So that's why it's so important to kind of follow that device and development process, because it really does, if you follow it, it really will help you to identify these things earlier and avoid you having to go back and repeat. So as we mentioned, design verification is all about proving your outputs meet your inputs. So proving that the product design meets the product requirements that you established as part of your inputs. So ultimately what you're doing is proving you've designed your device right. That's ultimately what you're trying to prove. And it covers quite a lot in terms of your function and performance of your device. So this is a bit of a, I suppose, a snapshot of design verification. As we mentioned earlier, it covers quite a lot of different aspects, but probably the key one to understand is the one in the middle, which is the kind of product specific design verification testing. So there are certain elements, and particularly all the ones around the outside would have standards related to them. You would follow the standards in terms of proving the safety and compliance of your device, but there will always be product specific testing. And for that type of testing, the onus is on the manufacturer to develop a relevant test, an appropriate test, and then prove that your product is safe and effective. Design validation then, as I mentioned, is all about proving your final medical device meets the user needs. And ultimately it shows you've designed the right device and that it will meet what the user needs it to do. And it's all about looking at the user interaction with the device and proving that the overall device does what you need to do in terms of its intended use. This generally cover things like usability testing, your summative usability testing, simulated use testing, and maybe even preclinical or animal testing, depending on what you need to prove within your device performance. I find it very hard to talk about these things without mentioning the quality management system. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but as I mentioned earlier, it is really foundational. So it's really, really important to have a quality management system. And probably the key thing to understand in terms of quality management system is these two things. Firstly, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And secondly, do what you say and say what you do. So your quality management system helps you to do this and make sure that you are documenting what you do as you go and that you're following your procedures and your protocols as you outlined it. Just a few notes on why it's important to start your QMS early. It establishes good habits from the very start. It'll help you with smoother audits and inspections, and it'll help you build in your risk management throughout your process. So you'll follow it as you go. It also helps a lot with investor and partner confidence. If they see that you have a clear quality strategy, that you're following a quality system, it really helps them. It really helps you build confidence with your investors and partners. It'll help you avoid a costly rework, as we mentioned earlier. The more you follow your process, the more engaged you are with it. The more likely you are to uncover issues early in play and have them designed out long before you get anywhere near design verification and validation. And ultimately, it'll help you with a faster path to market. It is a requirement for regulatory bodies. The earlier you have it in place, the more data you're putting through it that you can put in front of a regulatory authority to show the safety and effectiveness of your device. So the result, as we mentioned, it's all about the two products. And like I say, if this is the only thing you take home, I'll be very, very happy. But out of that comes your regulatory submission. So we mentioned the risk classifications of the device earlier on. So your medium and high risk devices will require regulatory clearance before they're placed on the market. Your lower class devices can be kind of a self-certified, but your medium and high risk will require a direct regulatory approval. You would then put in your submissions in your targeted jurisdictions, again linking back to your regulatory strategy. So where had you planned to target from a regulatory perspective? and what submissions are required in those jurisdictions. And always be, I suppose, conscious of the fact that approval timelines differ a lot by jurisdiction, and they can be pretty lengthy. I think anyone operating in the EU will certainly be familiar with that at the moment. I think the average timeline in the EU at the moment is 19.5 months. So quite a bit of time. So just to, I suppose, be prepared for that, and build that in as part of your overall business strategy. A note then in terms of the overall medical device life cycle, just that your responsibilities don't end at regulatory approval or commercialization. You will have to keep your technical documentation live and current throughout the full life of the product. Make sure you're feeding back in feedback from post-market surveillance through your risk management process, and follow up in terms of clinical follow-up on the product. So lastly, just I suppose to highlight some common pitfalls, and in particular around design and development. Firstly, start early, and I'm sure people have been told this before as well, but I really can't stress enough the importance of starting early. Build in DA as early in the process as you can. It'll enable a smoother and more efficient device development and accelerate time to market. So if you follow that process, you're identifying issues early, you're designing them out early, you won't have to repeat and rework. So really, really important to start as early as possible. Trust the process. It's there for a reason, and it's mandated for a reason in a lot of regulatory jurisdictions. But the process itself is designed to make sure that you're designing your device right, and keep you on track, in particular with respect to review, that you're continuously checking that you're on track, and that your product is right and what you need it to be. So trust the process. Risk management, really, really, really important. And again, identifying those risks early in play. You can address them early in play, and it means that your device is inherently safe by design, but also that you're designing out those issues at the start of the project rather than uncovering them as you go through it. And then lastly, I would just say in terms of timing, a lot of medical device testing can be expensive, and some of it can be really lengthy, especially big ticket items like your biocompatibility. So I just, I would always caution to people, consider when you kick off that type of testing, especially, if your design is still in flux. Just make sure at the end of the day, you'll have to prove the data for the product you're putting on the market. So if something crops up later, you have to change that design. It may impact the testing you've already carried out. It may cause you to repeat that testing. So I would always just caution, I suppose, consider when you start what your tests are and when you start them in your process. I love this quote, and it's so apt. There's never time to do it right, but there's always time to do it over. And I think this is a really good cautionary tale, in particularly with design assurance. And I think it really kind of underlines why it's so important to follow that design assurance process, and why, why you're trying to uncover issues or find risks early in play, so that you're addressing them as you go through the process and before you get too far down the road. So I'm going to leave you with this quote, and it's my last slide. This is a quote from one of my colleagues, Aoife, and there's actually, if you check out our LinkedIn page, you'll find a Q&A there with her as well on this topic as well. So some really good tips in there too. But treat design assurance as part of your innovation strategy, not as red tape. It isn't intended to be red tape. It is actually intended to support your device development and support you in doing it right. The earlier you integrate it, the faster you can move without tripping over compliance hurdles later. So really important to understand that. And the medtech race isn't won by the fastest sprinter. It's won by the team who runs smart, keeps a clean track record, and can provide the documented evidence. So I think it really sums up the importance of design assurance and how it feeds into your innovation pathway, and keeping your device development on track. So that is me. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Katie, have we any questions?
Yeah, if people can pop their questions in the Q&A, and thank you so much for that, Sharon. That was really well presented, and I love your packing the parachute piece for design assurance. So I'm going to be keeping that line for the future. Um, Loads of questions popping up there for me as you're going through, and one of the things that I was thinking, you were talking about the regulatory strategy, and jurisdiction came up a couple of times, and especially if you're a startup. I know we're talking with people that are new. Is there a right way about would you put down all the jurisdictions you would ideally like to be selling to over the next few years, or is less more? Or how do you decide that? And how does that then affect the strategy going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. And a real challenge for medical device developers. It is really hard to figure out what your pathway is going to be. Um, I suppose what I would say to people is firstly, look at where you sit from a risk classification device in your target jurisdictions. Firstly, you might find it could be the case that you are a different classification in one versus another, and it might present a different pathway and perhaps a more efficient pathway in one jurisdiction over another. Um, and the other thing I would look at is maybe the requirements in those jurisdictions and how they differ, and whether or not some of those requirements might be, I guess, an easier pathway or a path of least resistance, for want of a better word. But yeah, no, great question, and really challenging to work that out. Absolutely.
Thanks very much for that. There was a few more questions there. Another one that came into my mind as well was around gathering user needs. What would the typical sources of that be?
Again, another great question. So the most important thing from a user needs perspective is that you know who your users are. And that's anybody really who comes in contact with the device, right through from distribution, use. It may be the patient themselves that use it, maybe a carer, and right out to disposal as well. So it's actually the full remit in terms of the use of the device that you would need to consider as part of user needs. Um, Probably, like as I say, the most important thing is understanding who they are, and then go out there and talk to them, understand what their pain points are with existing devices, understand the clinical need that you're trying to address, and in particular where it might be a product that's either used by a carer or the patient themselves. Really, really important to understand the difference, I guess, between a trained clinician and a patient, and their needs might be very, very different in terms of what they would need the product to do and how they'd need it to work.
Oh, very good. Well, we also have a question in the Q&A, so I can see one here. Since regulatory agencies across global markets have varying requirements and evaluation parameters, to what extent does the technical documentation need to be adapted or customized for submissions to different regions?
Again, it will be in line with whatever the regulations are for that particular jurisdiction. So a good example of that would be, say, the difference between FDA and EU MDR, and the specific requirement for things like clinical evaluation, which is a much higher bar in the EU compared to the FDA. There's a specific requirement around clinical evaluation. So you will have to adapt your technical documentation depending on the requirements for the different jurisdictions. That would be typical of the case. Now, it is likely a certain amount of the data that you have would be applicable to more than one jurisdiction, but the likelihood is you may present it in a different way, or you may need additional data for certain jurisdictions.
Thanks very much. And I have another question here. How does design assurance apply in the post-market phase? Because you did touch on the post-market phase.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the post-market phase, I know I've concentrated very much here today on the design and development piece itself, but the post-market phase is absolutely key in terms of the life cycle of the device. So all of the post-market data that comes back in through your post-market surveillance, through complaints, through events, through literature, even looking at other similar devices on the market. All of that information gets fed back in to the technical documentation of the product, and in particular through your risk management process. So if through your complaints, for example, you might identify maybe there's a particular complaint that keeps arising. Maybe it had a higher occurrence than you had originally thought. Maybe that's something you need to look at and address. So the post-market piece of design assurance is equally as important as the work done during the development process.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I have another one here for you as well. If you had to pick one element of the design and development process as the most important, which one would it be?
Oh, definitely design inputs. Definitely design inputs. To me, they are absolutely the foundation of your design. It's your inputs that influence your design decisions. How you define those really defines the overall design of your device. So I think to me, the inputs are definitely the most important part of the process.
And I actually have Anna's written out a question again. Be like Apple, that is not a medical device but has FDA approved ECG, etc., or create a device that will be medical device fully. As I maybe getting at whether you should start with not being versus being a medical device. That is what I'm maybe getting from that question.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the device
It
itself.
does.
So if it's
Yes.
there are some devices, if you fall under the definition of a medical device, you just are a medical device. So it's not that, I suppose it's important to point out, it's not a case of this is something that's an option necessarily, but in some cases, some devices may go out on the market as maybe a welfare or a health product first, and then expand their intended use into a medical device. And I suppose it's just important to understand that kind of nuance exists, but it's not, I wouldn't recommend that you change your device design to follow that pathway. But if you already fall kind of in that gray area, it may be an option.